Yes, good afternoon. So I have 20 minutes. I will be a bit quick, but you will have the slides. The other thing I do on a daily basis in my team is looking at the CCS directive. And that's the main reason why I'm very happy to be here. And it was already a very enjoyable evening last night with all these conversations, and this morning was great. So what I wanted to talk about today is three topics from a DG Klima perspective. Of course, we are all together in the Commission, and some things Vasilios gave already away, but bear with me for a second. So first is EU funding for CCUS. So I think we talked about it already. We have a pathway, and we have a specific target. So the perspective we take in DG Klima is 2030 and then 2050. And the pathway is not just a pathway, it's actually a law. It's the climate law. This is legally binding for member states in the European Union. And so this is our perspective when we talk about CCS. And what does it mean? It means that there is a lot of CCS part of the underlying climate model that we have developed in the Commission, which underpins the climate law. And depending on which study you look at, it's between 80 million or 300 million tons. By 2050, that would be remaining emissions that need to be stored or taken out of not reaching the atmosphere. So then the question is, how is this going to happen? There is a bit of uncertainty depending on the availability of natural carbon sinks. You are aware of this, but it's a lot. 300 million tons per year is a huge amount into climate. We have heard this. So what have we done? We have created the Innovation Fund. The Innovation Fund is a European funding instrument, a competitive funding instrument that is not funded from taxpayers' money. The money comes straight from the ETS, the emissions trading systems. We sell allowances on the market, we get the money, and we reinvest it into our industry to decarbonize. And one of the four pillars of this funding instrument is actually carbon capture and storage, and also use. So this is a funding instrument, a grant funding instrument. There is two types of calls, small-scale calls, large-scale calls, once a year each a call. The last large-scale call closed in July. The next one will open in November. I'm coming back to this. And what we do with this now, and from the beginning, is we also fund storage sites. In the first large-scale call, we had no applications that made it through at the end. But now, in the second call in July, we announced we have two storage sites which are part of an Innovation Fund project. One is in the Black Sea. The project is called ANVRA, and it's one of the CCUS value chain projects where there is an emitter together with a transport infrastructure and a storage operator to building a project together. And the other is the Coda terminal, which is very interesting for us because it's the carb fix technology in Iceland, something we have been looking at for years as a different way of storing CO2. And now we will see this in a project. When I say we will see this, this means that these projects will receive grants from the Innovation Fund, and their progress is tracked by our implementing agency, the Climate and Innovation Agency, CINEA. So we are with those projects when they develop, and we see sort of the struggles they have, and I'm coming back to this. Interesting on this is the price that carbon capture, Carbfix mentions in its applications for storage. That's, I think, a very interesting point here. But what it also means is that we are funding CO2 supply for storage operators, for future storage operators, because already in the first call we had capturing projects that don't have the storage site inside the project scope, but need a storage site in order to, what we call, do the financial close, which is the project is fully financed and can then become operational, which is an important milestone to catch up all these projects. And as I'm speaking here today, we have already on our books, as it were, 4.6 million tons of CO2 that will be captured in those projects and will need to be stored in the European Union, roughly around 29. So there is a bit of a ramp-up phase, but by 29, these volumes will be there. Also, we see sort of the pipeline of other capturing plants in our industries, and very much aligned with what ZEP also sees. We think, okay, if there are roughly around 30 more projects capturing, we might find a volume of 50 million tons by 2030. And the question is, where is the storage sites for that? And that's our concern. Just to note, this is still 6 times more needs to be there by 2050. So here we talk about 2030, and we have to have a mountain to climb. Now we are with those first projects, and we know what their discussions are with storage operators. And we see some signs which I think we should all be aware of, and somehow we need to find a solution. The first one is what I would call a chicken and egg problem. It's that each side of this value chain, the capturing installations, also the storage sites, they depend on a perspective of a business case to take investment decisions. And they depend mutually on each other, but they cannot for sure tell what they're going to do because it depends on this. So we know of many capturing installations or potential capturing installations in Europe that say, I cannot get a green light from my management board as long as I cannot tell my management board where is my storage site that I will ship the CO2 to. And that's understandable because it costs a lot of money to capture CO2. There's energy costs, there's others, and this hampers. On the other side, we see storage sites developing, that's good, but most of the time when we see them first, they already have emitters attached to them. That means the capacity is already in some ways pre-booked, and that's also understandable. Why would you do a storage site if you don't know who is your emitter? But why we are looking at this from DG Klima point of view is because we consider that by funding these projects, we are willing to pay for capacity enhancements. And that's important to note because in the CCS directive, there is not a lot of reasons why one could refuse access to a storage site or a transport infrastructure, but capacity constraints is one. And the antidote to this is more investments. And it is a task for member states to help in creating those investments. So that's a discussion we are starting with member states. Apart from CO2 supply, we are also funding the infrastructure, and Vasilios already mentioned it. The 10E regulation for energy networks includes storage and transport of CO2 now. So there is a possibility to create new PCIs, projects of common interest, that would include storage site, and that's something for member states, of course, to come together and propose these projects. So in a way, we try to inject a bit of urgency into all parts of the value chain by funding projects. Now, on what basis is this going to happen in Europe? On the basis of the regulatory framework that we have for CCS, which is already in place and rests on the CCS directive. We look at this as a very stable and very complete regulatory framework. Together, the CCS directive and the ETS directive basically cover everything that sort of is going to be needed. It might not have been done yet in practice, but the rules are there. And in a way, we see it more than urgent than ever, because now we have the legal binding targets for carbon neutrality. So we need to bring this project into this framework into practice. So in that context, we consider that access to storage site is a purely commercial matter. It's a company talking to another company, discussing a contract. And yeah, we need to ramp up the storage capacities, but that's a question of infrastructure investments, and that's something we need to all together discuss in member states. Also important because of some discussions that have been going on over the last months. From our point of view, liabilities are very important in CO2 storage, but they are settled already at the very first moment when the storage permit is provided to the operator. So there is no open liability question. After that, it's a commercial transaction between the supplier of CO2 and a storage operator. And of course, the conditions on liability can have a role on the price of storage, but the origin of the CO2 for the storage sites don't matter. There is no borders in this context in the internal market. And thirdly, there's always the question, okay, how will this be accounted for in terms of sort of who is responsible for the CO2, but also how does this feature with the national emissions in the UNPCC? We have looked into this. We find that the ETS rules are clear. the UN IPCC rules are also clear in this, so we believe there's nothing missing, with a small exception that, of course, in the ETS that is currently existing, only pipelines are transport infrastructure for CO2, but as a Commission we have already proposed to generalize this to other means of transport. It's negotiated with Council and Parliament at the moment. It's not controversial, so will come, and we already take this into account when we look at particular cases. Also, we have looked at cross-border transport and the London Protocol, and I know this is sort of a discussion at some point, and we have three good news, basically. We found that there is a very substantive alignment between what we already do in the European Union based on the regulatory framework that we have and what the London Protocol would require us to do if there were no regulatory framework in the EU. So that means, from our point of view, that the two directives can act as a relevant arrangement under the London Protocol, which means that member states already have these arrangements between themselves, everyone with everyone. Secondly, it means also good news for the operators because they can already benefit from the freedoms that these directives give them to have these commercial discussions and commercial contracts, regardless or not whether there is a bilateral agreement, because this doesn't touch sort of the regulatory framework in the EU. And good news also for those member states who still want to have a bilateral agreement under the London Protocol because they are signatory states, they can still have those agreements. There can be additional agreements, but they cannot touch the subject matter of what our regulatory framework determines in the Commission, and it cannot be a barrier for transport of CO2. But the CCS directive is 10 years old. So also in this, we have looked into this. We believe it's still fit for purpose, and there is a big value in keeping the rules constant and not changing the rules, but there are 4 guidance documents that the Commission has published right after the CCS directive was adopted. And these have been written 10 years ago, maybe with only saline aquifers in mind at the time, and they have, maybe there is a need for updating those. And in fact, we have indications from stakeholders and member states that there are also some ambiguity, so unclarities now in view of the progress that we have seen in those last 10 years. So we are going to update the guidance documents. What we have set out to do is a first list of topics that we have identified that need update. One is carb fixed technology deployment, so storage in mafic or basalt rocks. How does this work with a very clear Annex 1 of the CCS directive? Also, storage in hydrocarbon reservoirs is something which wasn't really considered at the time, and there might be some differences. And also, it was mentioned already today, CO2 specifications. There we see an important role because of these value chains. So the rules, the types of purity levels that we see are, of course, in the CCS directive more related to environmental impacts. But if you consider this in a value chain, as described, for instance, in the in the project, then there might be other conditions. But we also see market and regulatory experiences, also here a non-exhaustive list. I'm coming back to this. One is, what about the transition from hydrocarbon production to CO2 storage? What about potential overlaps of permits when a competent authority is looking at this, or when 2 competent authorities are looking at this, maybe? Secondly, what about the transparency about operator intentions or plans to use such reservoirs for CO2 storage? What about existing geological information that has come from these years and years of exploration of carbon hydrates into a need for finding carbon CO2 storage? Questions of data sharing have been mentioned. And then important for the storage applications, the whole aspect of financial security is something which not many permits have done yet, and where we would like to take the latest knowledge and the latest best practices. So what we are going to do is a process that involves stakeholders. We are working together with a consultant. It will be launched at the end of this year, beginning of next year. The first phase will be an analysis of all the updating needs that are discussed. And then there will be a public stakeholder workshop, at which point the draft modifications from the consultant will be put to you as stakeholders, and we are looking for feedback on those and questions and comments and so on. Also, we are very conscious that this is a non-exhaustive list that we have that I had on my slides. Maybe we have missed something, and there could be other things that would be needed, would have create an update need. So that's also very welcome. The idea is indeed to turn those guidance documents into a repository of best practices, so that member states who might not have done a storage permit yet, but want to do that in the coming years, can actually have a basis to see what are the best practices in each of these aspects that need to be looked at when a storage permit comes. So then our plan is that by the end of next year, we would adopt revised guidance documents, and then we would use these revised guidance documents to do capacity building workshops with the competent authorities and also with the industry to see, okay, how does this sort of guidance can now be operationalized? And at the end of this process, there might be points that still need some guidance, which cannot be done in the form of guidance documents to a non-binding guidance documents as it is, to a directive. So that's something where we keep the door open for potential other topics that would be generated by this discussion. Third point, towards a CCUS strategy for the EU. So in view of all of this, there is an understanding in the Commission that somehow we need to work together on achieving those aims with storage. Also because storage sites, you know better than me, are not equally distributed among member states. Emitters are not equally distributed, so there is an aspect of working together. And so we are doing that. There is the CCUS forum. The first happened last year in 21. Was an online meeting. DG Energy is sort of in the lead role on this. And we are taking this forward to a new plenary meeting, which will be next month, end of next month, on the 27th of October. But in between, we have launched 3 stakeholder working groups with a job to develop a vision paper, a position paper of CO2 infrastructure, and to see whether an industrial partnership like the Hydrogen Alliance would be something that would be useful in Europe. These working groups are, as we speak, working on those papers. It's stakeholders. The Commission hosts the meetings, and we open and close the meetings, but the discussions are really among stakeholders. The idea is that these positions will be represented in the forum plenary next year, in October. So what are then the next steps? It's pretty important to see what the stakeholder input will be to this forum, because we hope that we get a bit of a common view from both sides of the value chain, or even from all 3 sides. But we are also launching 2 studies. One with our colleagues in the JRC in Petten that looks at transport and storage infrastructure needs from a sort of bird's eye view. So where are the emitters? Where are the storage sites? Where would be the strategic infrastructure corridors that one would need to envision somehow in the internal market in order to bring the CO2 to those places? And another one with a consultant to look at the market development, the business cases, the way sort of the operators in those value chains will make money, with in the background the question, what would be the regulatory model that would be needed or not for such an infrastructure development. And there we have, of course, the developments in the UK as an example. And so this is something which we do. As said already, we will launch the review of the guidance documents at the beginning of the year, or at the end, I say optimistically here. The CCS forum working groups are also going to work further after the plenary session, and are expected to take what was discussed in the plenary also to finalize their position papers in the month after. And then there will be a lot of activity next year on CCUS, I have to say. When I wrote this slide, I was thinking, First, and very important, we have several Innovation Fund projects that need to find storage services. And when I say that, I mean find contracts to sign for storage services that don't necessarily start the day after, but give the certainty that the storage will be there when it's needed. We will keep, or the stakeholders are invited to keep the working groups alive, to also be sounding boards or bring new topics to our attention. Then, April next year, member states will have to provide to us in the Commission their national implementation reports about the CCS directive. Last time around, they were relatively short for most member states. We hope that this time around, they might be a bit not so short and a bit more flesh on the bones, as it were, in terms of information. Then we have around middle of the year, June is the target date, the stakeholder workshop around the guidance documents, which is the important meeting bringing transparency to this process. And also in June, member states have to notify to us their draft updated national energy and climate plans. And that's maybe an important occasion also for your community, because I think it would be good if each member state knows what potential porous space they have under their feet, and which of those parts could actually be developed into storage sites if they find that they have residual hard-to-abate emissions in their 2050 plans, because that's what the update is about, to look into the carbon neutrality future. And then, importantly, so at the end of next year, if things go to plan, we should have revised guidance documents on the CCS directive. We will also have a new PCI list, maybe with new storage, cross-border storage projects as PCIs. Who knows what member states will propose, and we would certainly encourage this from a DG Klima point of view. And we are working towards a Commission vision paper on CCUS. So we don't have yet a full sort of license to operate on this, but it is the idea of bringing these learnings together from the stakeholder process and charting the next steps also then for maybe the next Commission. And while we have these milestones, we are also continuously working on this topic. One is that we really consider the Innovation Fund projects as regulatory and market sandboxes. That is to say, we really see from the colleagues that run these projects what really happens on the ground when these discussions are happening, because we have these regular meetings. And we also have already done one, and if there is a need, we will do another one, a workshop with member states where these projects happen. The projects bring everyone to the table and discuss maybe coordination issues. Also, under the CCS directive, we have the so-called information exchange group, which brings together the competent authorities under the CCS directive, so the permitting authorities, in a forum with us, and we want to use this to share operational knowledge. Of course, we don't do permits ourselves; we just review them when we get them. So the hope is that colleagues from Norway, colleagues from the Netherlands would sort of share what they have done on these topics and share that with other colleagues. And then, as I said, during the year, the implementation of the 10E will be prepared so that at the end of the year, we'll have a list. So that's the plan for between now and the end of next year. And I understand that sort of at some point you will have another forum maybe, and then I hope that by that time we have some new things to discuss. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any question when there is time for that.